Erickson, Martha, Hudson, and then I also focused on theories created by Finney, who did a lot of multi-ethnic research, and on Maddox, who focused on appearance, which for the purposes of my dissertation I call phenotype. Well, it's called phenotype, but that's the word I use. I also looked into, I learned more about historical trauma. For the purposes of my dissertation, I really focused on colonization efforts such as blood quantum, which blood quantum is how much you are. Like, I'm 50%. Does that make sense? Like, Native Americans are the only ethnicity in North America to carry a card. Like, people expect them to carry a card. So that's why I looked into that. And then relocation efforts and, I forgot one of them. Anyway, I'll get to that. I also looked more into the influence of cultural events on well-being, so participating and knowing about your culture and participating in the traditions associated with it and how that connects to one's well-being. So that's what I researched. Out of my research, I created an interview, and it basically took aspects of these theories and information, and I created questions to ask participants to see how they thought that these might affect their personal experiences. So I'm going to give you a little preview of what I found. Results versus what I reviewed. So my results versus what I learned, other people's research. So do the theories supporting the existing models and literature support the participants' experience? The answer is yes and no. So we'll start with yes. Participants reported experiencing stages of all three models. Participants indicated that they experienced a connection between phenotype or appearance and Native American ethnicity. And they also were able to make a connection between participation in Native American traditions and well-being. And no, and I'm going to say not entirely, and I'll explain that further on down the line. Participants did not associate blood quantum or tribal enrollment requirements with being Native American. Participants did not associate historical grief responses, and in this case I mean substance abuse and boarding school attendance, with being connected to Native American culture. And they also did not directly associate relocation efforts with a connection to Native American culture. So that's a quick snapshot of my findings in the context of the literature. So my methodology. Basically what I did after I created my interview is I found 8 multiracial Native American individuals, and like Dr. Jenkins said, there was a wide range of age, ages 32 to 70 plus, because she wouldn't tell me beyond 70, which I thought was cute. 5 women, 3 men. 4 were recruited from a comprehensive health clinic that serves the needs of the local Native community, and then 4 were recruited by word of mouth. So my methodology, from what I proposed earlier, pretty much went to plan. I recruited the way I wanted to. My interviews all went pretty well. I did a thematic analysis of my data, meaning I read everybody's interviews a million times, and I pulled themes that were common among everybody's responses. So I came up with themes, which I'll explain in a minute. So that all went well. The one thing, the most prominent deviation that I had from my methodology was the use of the multi-group ethnic identity measure, the MEIM. This was created from Finney's research, and it's meant to measure an individual's level of commitment to their respective ethnicities and to kind of explore how they're exploring the culture associated with their ethnicities. So it was really, my participants had a hard time with it. They were confused. The items are hard. It's hard to tell which ethnicity they're targeting. So I just told them to fill it out to the best of their ability. I scored it in a qualitative manner, meaning I didn't use a numerical score for the MEIM. It does ask for one, but I didn't use a numerical score. I used the results from the MEIM to further describe my interview answers and support them. So I'll also talk about that when I talk about my results. So my results. I'm sorry I didn't bring you guys a printout. I can make everyone a printout after if you're interested. But this is an overview of my domains and themes. So I organized the prominent themes that I found after I read everybody's data several times, and I found the themes that emerged. I organized them into 4 domains. So the domains were homeland connection, phenotype, exploration and awareness, and connection between participation in Native American cultural traditions and ethnic identity. I'm really sorry that I don't have a printout for you because that would have been a lot easier. You'll notice that I put the level of influence I found each theme to make. I think for this slide I'll actually pause for questions because I don't have a printout and I want to make sure if you guys have questions about this I can tell you now.
Yes, I do have a couple questions.
Okay.
Thank you. It's a nice slide. First one is, by what means did you determine strong, moderate, or low? Was that qualified?
Okay. So for strong, I considered it if 8 to 7 participants spoke about this theme. Moderate was more than 4, and then like 4 and under. And normally from my dissertation, it turned out to be like 1 or 2 was low. So that's how I determined that. So.
And because of the confusion with the meme, do you think it was useful for you? I'm ahead of this, of course, I have later on. But with your subjects finding it confusing, did you find it was useful for you, or is there a better tool?
A meme? Mm-hmm. I didn't find it that useful. I felt like it kind of repeated a lot of what I was already asking. No. I wish it happened.
So since you raised the question about the meme, could I ask another question related to that? Because you mentioned that it was confusing to participants, and it was related to not knowing which of their, because they were biracial, multiracial, not knowing which of their identities to relate to on that. So you had no idea either then which of their identities they related to as they responded to them?
I did. They said Native.
Oh, they did say
So
Native.
we would talk about it, and I didn't want to
Okay.
lead them, and I said, to the best of your ability. So they're like, well, since this is about my Native
Okay, good. Well,
part, then that's what we're going to
important.
focus
All right.
on. So I didn't want to lead them, but I was like, let's do it.
Okay. All right, that's important. All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Participant demographics. So I had 8. I'll just pause on this for a minute. I just wanted to point out on this slide that I actually, I listed, I have a thing of, what is that red laser thing about nowhere? I listed as they listed on their demographics what they were. So it was really interesting to me. I tried to do it exactly the way they did it.
So are you going to speak to the age later in terms of, because I was really impressed that you had what appeared to be an older sample than, because 25 and older was your range, right? I mean, your cutoff was 25 or older.
I think right now I'll just address it now because I don't address it too much in my dissertation of defense. But I will say the woman who 70 plus, I would say she would be somebody who would be one of the most, it would be interesting because she's the only one who talked about boarding school attendance, and I would say this is due to her generation. And she didn't attend boarding school, but her mother did. And she was really, when I was interviewing her, she kind of glossed over it. She's like, oh, it wasn't a big deal. My mom, but then she also said my mom was discouraged from learning her language or practicing her traditions, and I do think it affected her family. But then she was like, but not enough. And she just kind of, but she is the only one, when I asked that question, do you know anything, anyone in your family attended a boarding school or know anything about it? She's the only one who said anything.
Were the others aware?
Hmm?
Were the other participants aware? I know she's the only one that said something.
No, I didn't talk about.
The other ones weren't knowledgeable?
No, of what boarding school? I mean, they knew what it was, but they were all like, no, I don't think anyone in my family. So that was interesting to me because, yeah, I found out about our own family that there was possible boarding school attendance. But I don't know, I guess I would have answered the same way they did. And then for participant 2, I would say a lot of her, which I'm going to talk about her more, a lot of her choices to identify had to do with civil rights movement and her experiences as a young adult. So So something that a lot of the younger ones would not have maybe experienced as much. So
Were you surprised you didn't get more participants on the younger end of the spectrum? That was really more, I was wondering if it had to do with where you recruited, or was it something about, I just was curious about how you how you thought about the fact that your population leans towards an older group as opposed to younger.
I think because what I got from my interviews was that these people, most of them were really thinking about this already, and this was part of their lives, and they were interested in talking about it. I did ask for people over 25, and like I said, some of it was word of mouth, so I think this was like a peer group also kind of a thing. So I would be, a lot of my participants did say, like, in my young adulthood, I started to think about this more, or I even became aware of it. So these people already had, I think they felt like they had something to give me, right? So that's what I know about that. All right, so I will get into my discussion. So I organized my findings into 3 prominent factors. This draws from all the themes I just showed you. It's just one of the best ways I could explain it. The 3 prominent factors were caretaker influence, which was the most prominent factor, and there was caretaker influence pretty much influenced everything. All the themes would be at the top. Phenotype was the second most prominent factor, and then engagement in Native American culture and traditions was the third most prominent influential factor. So I'll explain each one of these. So caretaker influence influenced the consistency with which a participant identified as Native American. So people with stronger caretaker influence, they were able to talk about, these people were able to talk about who in their family identified, what tribe they were from, their history. These people on the MEIM and on their demographic identified as Native American. They were generally the ones who would say Native American, African American, Caucasian, like I pointed out in the participant slide, which I really wish I had for you guys. The people who had less caretaker influence were likely to not know their tribe or know their tribe, but kind of be more ambivalent on their demographics, and on their MEIM they would say they were mixed, or they were also, when they would talk to me, more specific about what order they thought their ethnicities went in, like I'm this much of that. So I found that was pretty interesting. Knowledge of their culture and connection to Native culture, so people with caretaker influence tended to have more knowledge, history, and also knowledge of traditions. People with less caretaker influence didn't have pretty much any. And then, I'm going to give you an example. I guess I'll give it to you now. I just want to give you an example of 2 participants. I felt like this was a really good parallel that kind of emphasized caretaker influence. These 2 participants had the same background. They were Latino and Native, not from the same tribe, but they both actually grew up in a very similar environment in the same city. Both of them told me, one of them told me he had no caretaker influence, and one of them told me he had just a little bit of caretaker influence, and they're also roughly the same age. And the person with just a little bit of caretaker influence, this was a grandmother that he didn't live with, reconnected with his tribe and his community and is very active, and the other person was very ambivalent and did not connect. He was interested, but he just didn't find the means, I guess. But I just thought it was really interesting, just that little bit of caretaker influence and knowledge really encouraged him. So a little bit goes a long way. I thought that was a good...
If I may, a quick question there. When they were connecting to their culture, was that back on the reservation, or was that in an urban area someplace? Did any of them go back home?
One of them, this is the one who connected to his culture, did start in an urban area. He joined a club or a group at his college, and then he wanted to learn more, so he did go back to his reservation.
Okay. And did any of them see different cultural experiences in the reservation as opposed to the urban areas where they may have grown up? They're
Yeah,
pretty much the same.
and they're he said very different, actually. And also engagement in the exploration of Native culture. People with stronger caretaker influence engaged in the active exploration. They also indicated on the MEIM that they were exploring their Native American heritage. And by active, I mean more actually participation, learning the language, having more access to where to look things up. People who had less caretaker influence generally engaged in passive exploration, meaning they Googled their tribe name, or, and I'm not putting that down because I Googled mine, but it was just more like, oh, this is just what I found, and I read a book once. So that was more of my response from people. Next is phenotype. Everybody talked about their appearance. I mean, I asked about it, so they talked about it. This was really important, and I'm going to expand on this later when I talk about my results in the context of the literature. But validation and acceptance and connection to Native heritage. Two participants spoke about a time where these people didn't have a lot of caretaker influence or knowledge about their Native culture, but they both had experience with Native American peers, and those peers validated their connection based on their appearance. Like one person was walking down the street next to the center, and a Native peer said, "Oh, you're Native American," and she was so thrilled. I mean, this was her major connection, and she told me the story like over and over again. So, and I also had another participant talk about an experience like that. So they kept naming that as like a thing that really connected them. So it was very important. And a majority of my participants talked about challenges from both groups, both of their ethnic groups or all of their ethnic groups, like, oh, you don't look this way, you don't look that way. But 4 of them spoke about just outright discrimination, and that's something I'm going to talk about more in a few slides down. I just really want to give that time, so I will talk about that. And then the third is engagement in Native American traditions. It's different than exploration. It does sound the same, but engagement would be just going to powwows, going to sweat lodges, going to pipe ceremonies. So once again, caretaker influence was a big deal here. People with stronger caretaker influence were able to engage more and did this daily. They said it was part of their life. People with less caretaker influence did not, some didn't even engage at all, except for participant 2. She didn't know her tribe. She didn't have ties to her homeland, but she is one of the strongest supporters and participators in the Native community and where I interviewed. I saw her at all the events, and she has a lot of knowledge about it, so that was really interesting.
But she doesn't know her tribe.
No.
Interesting.
No, I'm going to talk about her more. And I just want to say quickly about her, the reason I think, and part of the reason she said that she's so knowledgeable, she's also very knowledgeable about her African American background. And she told me this is the time in her life that she wants to learn the most about herself. So I think she's just very active and she's very smart and knows how to get information. So I think this is what kind of made her one of the outliers.
I'm going to take you sideways again. I apologize.
It's
You
okay,
got me
I'm gonna get some
intrigued
water.
here. Yes, absolutely. Take advantage of that. I found myself as you're talking, and I don't know anything at all about this, but some of the new research is coming out regarding DNA. And I'm thinking about like 23andMe. I wonder if there's anything of that she could get to find out about herself in terms of making it very specific, tying it into tribes.
She might, but this is one of the interesting things I found about her. So she gave an interview, and on the radio, for some reason, she used to be a journalist, and am I allowed to say that? That was her job, and a professor from somewhere contacted her and said, "Oh, I think you're from this tribe. I want to correspond with you." And she said she just dropped the ball. And I was like, "Why? Why?" And she's like, "I don't know why. I just don't know why." And I found that really interesting. There was like such a high level of ambivalence for somebody who was so active. So, so I don't know. Maybe she would be interested in that. She's also, when I kept encouraging her to Google things, she's like, "I don't know how to use the internet."
Oh, she is resistant. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, that was. Everybody was able, and I'm going to talk about this more. Again, I'm going to keep threatening you all to talk about it more, but I am. I'm going to expand. Ability to associate participation with well-being. Everybody was able to associate participation in Native traditions with well-being. The difference was their knowledge, which I'm going to talk about. So like I've been threatening you, I'm going to talk about all these findings in the context of the literature that I reviewed before I did my interview. So I did this. I wanted to use the stuff that's already available to support to see if it supports my participants' experiences and to help me understand better what their experiences meant, I guess, in a academic sense. So I start out with Erickson's psychosocial model, more specifically the fifth stage, which is identity versus identity diffusion. Poston's biracial model, choice of group identification is one of the stages, and then his appreciation stage. Marcia's identity model, which just an aside about Marcia's, Marcia and Finney did very similar research, and I think they did research together because I have references of them together. Marcia's model focuses on stages of exploration and commitment. So basically, these stages kind of explain how much exploration the person is doing and how much commitment, but they're fluid. The person can go back and forth. I also use Maddox's phenotype model, and then the information I learned about historical trauma regarding blood quantum, tribal enrollment, and relocation. So let's start out at the beginning. Identity versus identity diffusion. All of the participants said that they began to explore their native ethnicity during their adolescences or young adulthoods. So this is pretty close to what the literature already says. What was interesting is that people with less caretaker influence generally started exploring because of inquiries from outside sources. So a lot of them said, I was looking for college money. Some people said, oh, people kept asking me what I was because of my name or because of how I look. So that was more prevalent with those participants than the participants who already knew about their culture, more about their culture. Those participants just talked about like strengthening their connection to their ethnicity, learning more about their family. And they also talked about outside sources, but not as much as people with less caretaker. Next is foreclosure and moratorium, which, like I said, was Marcia's stages of exploration and commitment. Foreclosure is pretty much, it's like the stage before identity and identity diffusion. It's like, I'll compare it to like when you're a child and you just hopefully believe everything your parents say, and that's where you get your information from your surrounding community and your parents. You don't really question it, and you are generally like whatever ethnicity they tell you are. Moratorium is when you start exploring more, and this can go on for your lifetime, and you can go back and forth. And the people in my study who tended to move back and forth were identified as African American and Native American. They also experienced choice of group identification, so that describes a feeling of having to pick one group. Like, I am only Caucasian for these reasons. And when I asked them why did you choose to be African American at certain points of your life and not identify as any other ethnicity, most of them said, 3 of them said, because I felt a lot of discrimination against the African American ethnicity, and I wanted to show solidarity because I wanted to be closer to certain family members. So that was a really common answer among that group. And then people who were in moratorium, by the time I got to them, they indicated that they were in moratorium, generally reported that they had limited caretaker influence, were likely to have more ambivalence about identifying as Native American, and then also indicated low to moderate levels of exploration and commitment on their MEIM. So that's the difference. The end stages of these models are very similar. Appreciation and achievement basically means you appreciate all of your ethnicities. It's an integration and more of an acceptance. And just so everyone knows, you can also move out of this, but the participants that I spoke with that were in these stages tended to indicate that they were staying there. They had gone through foreclosure, back and forth, moratorium, foreclosure, and then they're now in appreciation and achievement. These participants tended to report strong caretaker influence, a strong connection to their community, which is a big thing in Native culture. It isn't about the individual, it's about the community. So the fact that they were able to make this their focus really said a lot, that they really did understand and explore. They also indicated a high level of commitment and exploration through their responses on the MEIN. And then they also indicated if they had kids that they were teaching their children the culture as well. People who reached achievement and appreciation were able to better reconcile their Native ethnicity with all of their ethnicities. So they were very clear about what their influences were and what their ethnicities were. So moving on from the models and the theories to phenotype. So this is not something I found a lot of information about my specific findings in the existing literature. So participants who identified as African American, Native American, and female, for them phenotype was very important, and we talked a lot about it. They also reported that they experienced discrimination from their outgroup, and in this, for my dissertation, I mean people who are not Native American. So they often talked about being like beaten up and attacked for their appearance, and just having a really hard time being told that they weren't African American, they didn't look right, just really a lot in their childhood and adolescence, and it was very painful. And so these participants, and this is something I just thought of, participant 2 spoke about this a lot, and she also is such an active participant in the Native community and the traditions, and I think, I shouldn't say this outright, but I think she gets a lot of healing from this participation. So I think that's another reason why she's so adamant about learning more and participating. So I'm going to keep going. They also reported that they experienced discrimination based on their appearance when they participated in Native American cultural events. This is very damaging because, like I said earlier, connection to your community and the Native community is huge. It's like your identifier. So if you're going to these events and people are giving you dirty looks, like one girl said that they were just staring at her and giving you dirty looks, and you feel like you can't connect, then it's really damaging and it breaks your connection. But I will say these participants were very resilient and they kept going, and they're also, 2 of them were the ones that were in achievement, so they were able to reconcile, and I think that they drew strength from participating in both communities strongly. 2 of these participants also reported experiencing events that validated their connection. One of them I talked about participant 2, but participant 7, we spoke about phenotype a lot. She's African American and Navajo, and she went to a Navajo reservation, I don't know where, not in California, anyway, she went, and she said it was the best thing ever because there were so many people that looked like her there. And she said, I've been struggling in California for years because no one looks like me and they don't accept me. But when I went there, she was just so happy. And I really wanted to share that because it made me happy. And then 2 people indicated that they thought it would be easier to be Caucasian than Native. So I also felt like that was really poignant to think to be part of the colonizing race and Native would be easier. Like I was like, oh, so I just wanted to point that out.
So I guess that,
I'm
oh no,
sorry.
you're going to say it. No, go. I'm going to wait till you finish with this because I may not have a question.
Okay, I'm going to drink more water.
Okay. Because the question
that
I was
whenever
going to
you need.
ask actually was, why do you think the phenotype was so salient for the African American Native participants? And I see you have more slides here, so you may actually be speaking to it.
Yeah, I am, because I have
There
theories,
was
but
a lot of interview information, they focused on that. So
yeah.
we do have a lot of data.
We even talked about it after the interview. We talked about it a lot. So they put my reference in there. Well, what I read was validation from members of one's in-group. And for my purposes, it's both, but I'm going to talk about African American in this particular slide, is influential in the fostering of a sense of belonging to one's ethnic group. So you obviously want to be accepted by your ethnic group, and if you're told you aren't part of that because of how you look, I mean, that's horrible. And I can imagine, I mean, it's hard to want to connect and foster a stronger connection. Mainstream culture emphasizes the connection between women's appearances and identity more than men. So basically, women are our appearance, right? Like, oh, you're pretty, and that's what you are. So if you connect this with your culture, well, you're white, so you look white, you are white, that's it. And it's easy for outgroups to challenge you on your appearance, which leads me to Maddox's theory about ethnic belonging is questioned based on stereotyped expectations of correct ethnic appearance. So if you don't look right, you get called out, right? You don't look native enough, you're not brown enough, your cheekbones aren't high enough. If you're African American, your hair is not the right way, your skin isn't the right color. And that's what most of my participants actually named this on some level, of someone saying, like, if you don't have enough body hair, you're not tall enough. This was other people telling them, and then telling them they weren't part of that group. So.
Did they identify who the other people were who were saying this? Were they other Native people? Were they Caucasians? In a sense about who?
Everybody.
Okay, just
like,
across the board.
Yeah, whoever. Because I said, is there, like, I wanted them to specify more, and they said they got it from both,
across the board.
all ends. Even people who had no connection to either group would comment on their appearance.
So then, was it more common for those who were had an ethnicity other than African American with Native to fit that stereotype expectation? Because I was just curious again, what because I understand those points as well, but I was just very concretely wondering what made the difference in their experience in the world. So if they were less inclined to fit either the typical stereotype of African American or Native, but if they were Native and Chicano, they could. Do you know what I'm saying? Or
Oh, yeah.
They could blend.
right, that's what I'm saying. I'm wondering if that was a factor with this.
I don't know if it's a fact, but I would say that's my guess.
Your hunch.
Those people who identify it as Latino and Native were, I don't want to say it like not milder, but they're like I wanted to differentiate between challenges and discrimination. Like I felt like it was like, oh, that's when I was saying, you don't have enough body hair, but nobody was like, get out or glaring at him. They just like made a side comment, like a.
Interesting.
And I don't want to minimize that because it is damaging. It just wasn't like you don't belong here. I'm gonna stare at you the entire time. So okay. So colonization efforts. I'm going to start with relocation, and I know that slide was a long time ago, but this is a no, not entirely, and it's because nobody said to me, oh, the forced removal is why, it really affects my ethnic identity, but it was evident and how the participants, everybody, not just people with less caretaker influence, influenced participants' knowledge of their native culture. So just for an example, most tribes in North America have a creation story. The creation story is tied to their original homeland, not their reservation, not where they've been moved, not Arizona, unless that's where they're from. But so most of the people living where I interviewed are not that connected to their original homeland, and that really changes how do I say it? How they have the traditions and participate in them. So it does, across the board, affect everybody. And a lot of people with stronger caretaker influence were talking to me about, like, I don't know this, I don't know that. It's really hard to find these things out because basically scattered in knowledge has been, for the lack of a better term, watered down. So it looks different now. And people with more caretaker influence and connection know this, and it is damaging. People with less caretaker influence didn't name that specifically, but they didn't have a lot of access to knowledge about their culture. It also through people's caretakers and knowledge affected how they identified. People were more ambivalent. Not everybody, but we talked about the ambivalence. Also, knowledge of how to use traditions associated with Native American culture to deal with historical trauma response. People weren't. It was harder for people to take from their traditions and heal themselves, I guess. I mean, it wasn't uncommon, and it wasn't like they weren't doing it. It just, I think, an understanding of historical trauma response was relatively new. I kind of was getting that from their responses. And then the landscape of Native communities, one of the participants who had a strong connection named this, that the landscape of their community was changing. And it was because basically of relocation. People were being moved around. And I want to also point out that contemporary relocation has a lot to do with one's reservation, because most of the reservations, people live in poverty and people have to move off just to survive. So relocation is continuing. Blood quantum and enrollment. Participants who indicated that they felt blood quantum requirements and tribal enrollment were discriminatory were the ones with strong ties to their culture. They indicated that knowledge of their ancestral lineage defines and supports their connection, and that was the most important thing. You know who your grandparents are, who's part of your family, who your tribe is. You can talk about your tribe. And participant 2, I felt really sad because something that really hurt her, along with her issues with appearance, was the fact that she goes to these community events and she cannot name her ancestors and her connection. And she told me, she's like, it makes me feel really bad and like I don't fit in. So people who indicated that they were ambivalent in regard to these colonization efforts had limited knowledge of their Native heritage, and they actually didn't know what most of this was. They knew about relocation, but they didn't know what blood quantum or tribal enrollment was. And when I explained it to them, they remained ambivalent, and they kind of said, like, well, I could see how that could connect you. I guess if you need, like, benefits, and I could see how full-blooded natives might not appreciate people who are, like, 1% saying they were Native. So those were some of the answers I got. Engagement in Native traditions. All the participants associated engaging in Native traditions with feeling grounded, support, and cultural connection. The big difference is participants with strong caretaker influence recognize engagement as a part of their daily life. They also were more specific. They're like, I'm supported by my community. I'm connected to these aspects of my culture. Whereas people with less caretaker influence were more vague. They did say, oh, I think I would feel grounded. I think I feel a connection. But I think the biggest difference here is community. Like, people who had less caretaker influence did not work into the concept of community, into their identity, like people who had a connection and caretaker influence. People who did participate and had strong caretaker influence were able to describe the ways their well-being was enhanced. So one participant would say, like, I went to a pipe ceremony and it helped, she was talking about a problem she was having, and going to the pipe ceremony helped her clear it up in a certain way, or a sweat helped her feel clarified. So they were more specific. So the limitations. I had limited ethnic combinations. It was impossible for my sample to represent a majority of the ethnic combinations that comprise North America's multi-ethnic landscape. My sample was mostly females, of 75% women, and 75% of these females were African American and Native American, so my ethnic combination was limited even among females. And then I spoke about the limitations of the MEIM. Implications. The implications of my study, the main one was a need to help multiracial Native Americans connect to their culture, and in this way learn more about their ancestral lineage, access healing benefits of participation, enhance their self-awareness, help individuals who spoke about this cope with the changing landscape of the Native community and foster a sense of belonging, especially for individuals with a high level of discrimination in regard to their multi-ethnic background. My recommendations, use of a cultural genogram. I love genograms so much, even more after I researched them. I think would be really helpful. A cultural genogram, I guess I would describe it best as like a family tree. That's pretty specific, like where are your parents from, what were their cultural beliefs, what traditions, what languages. So that's what we focus on with that. It kind of helps organize and then bring everything together for clients. It would help clients and clinicians understand the client's worldview, where it comes from and what it is now, and problem-solving preferences, issues and beliefs associated with the client's specific ethnic combinations, the client's ancestry, which is a key piece of identification for Native American people, and cultural issues that may contribute to transference and countertransference within the client clinician relationship. For instance, if like a Caucasian clinician is working with a Caucasian or a Native person, a multiracial Native person, I mean, it would be good for that clinician to understand the history between intermarriage of Caucasians and Natives, because it will manifest in the room. Future research. Research focusing on specific factors such as phenotype and caretaker influence. My interview was broad. I'm probably focusing on the three main factors I told you in the middle of this would be great, expanding on those. Research into the experiences of male-identified and two-spirit identified multiracial individuals. I did not include two-spirit identified because I think I just would not have been able to do those participants justice. It would have been a completely different experience. And then a focus group in which participants of the study may discuss the themes that emerge from the data set. And he's out there.
Thank you.
I have a
Now we
question.
can open it up.
Okay.
If you could go back to your implication slide, or recommendations, maybe it's the recommendations, yeah.
Okay.
So you also worked in the Native American Health Center, and I guess I was particularly struck by what you were saying about the struggles of African American and Natives in terms of discrimination both within and outside.
Mhm.
So from that perspective, in terms of clinical work, what did you see that worked? I mean, how were multiracial folks welcomed or received in that context? What were the kind of the clinical issues within kind of a native health serving environment that you could say, well, this is some of the issues that would need to be addressed. This is how belonging can be created. And speaking both to the client and the clinician. I mean, because I know it's always easier to speak outside, but I'm just curious because of that particular finding.
I think what worked. So that clinic is just very welcoming. I haven't worked in a lot of clinics like that. They were just awesome. They really were. So one of the first places I felt so welcomed and understood. I think what was good there is that people talked a lot. We had a lot of groups, a lot of processing, and I think for those participants, like I said at the end about the focus group, having a focus group for those particular participants might have been helpful so that people can talk about what works for them. I think the small amount I got from them was 2 or 3 of those participants are very strongly connected to their community by participating and learning. And they all said, people give me dirty looks, I don't feel welcome all the time, but they just keep going. And they look for connections. So I think having everyone, focusing on community and making this subset of community so people can brainstorm. I think that would have been helpful.
It's interesting what you pointed out because the Native American Health Clinic is being looked at quite as a model because of just the openness. And I'm not quite sure if it's just a mixture of so many different diversities within California that is represented or not. I don't know how it would look in other areas. So if you had the Native American Health Center in a more fine area of other Native Americans if you would find that much openness, or as much openness. So interesting.
It's the Bay Area too. So
Mhm.
I have something like that.
I think two questions.
Hold on for a second, I want to make sure the committee members have time before, and then I'm going to open it up to them.
I have some, but I'm afraid it's going to take us too far afield, so let me sit on it a bit longer. Draw an analogy, maybe.
Okay. So I'll open it up.
Thanks. The first question is about the sort of the trajectory, about the identity diffusion to the crystallization period. And I was curious whether or not, if you looked, for example, between Native Americans who were mixed race with other minorities versus those who were Caucasian, whether there was a different trajectory or just a different pattern that emerged, or for example, older versus younger, in terms of what were the factors, and was there a difference in terms of, for example, was discrimination more likely to cause crystallization for one subpopulation versus the other,
For my dissertation, my group.
or in the literature, either way?
Well, in the literature, so Poston's model, which is what this is coming from, is focused on the experiences of African American and Caucasian biracial people. Is that experience on any other group? So, what my participants said, my African American and Native American identified participants did fall in line with Poston's explanation. So, what would crystallize them in foreclosure is that feeling that discrimination, and I think they wanted to feel solidarity and to be a part of the African American community. I want to say they felt safer, and they wanted to back up that community. One person did just flat out say that, like, I wanted to represent and back up this community, and that was, this person said she did it in her late teens. And so I think that, that's when you're feeling vulnerable, right? Your late teens. Like, I feel vulnerable all the time, but late teens is a big one. And, if you're being discriminated against and challenged, I can imagine that you want to feel safe and solidified. And then from what I could tell from what they were telling me, later on when they started learning more about their native culture and feeling more I want to say accepted, but just having more knowledge and ability to participate, then they felt safer to move into moratorium. And then, do you want, I guess, achievement? I think these particular participants were just very strong. I mean, they were able to reconcile all of their experiences, and they knew where to look for support, right, from both groups. And I think they took their discriminatory experiences and then looked for support. And later on, when they were experiencing less of a heaviness, they were able to really find a place to feel supported in their communities. Does that answer your question? Okay.
You have
That's
a
it.
follow-up?
Is it a separate one from that?
Yes.
Okay, hold that. He got into where I was sitting and toying with, so let me ask my question then. So I'm thinking about a Native American community, but it's a different Native American community, and I'm thinking about some of the conflicts there. And the population that I'm talking about are Hawaiians, who are Native people.
Yeah.
Their quantum got watered down, not usually through marriage, but through rape. And because of the land issues and a few other things, school system coming out of schools, etc., you have to be able to demonstrate a certain amount of Hawaii blood in order to participate. A problem is that Hawaiians are looking whiter and whiter and whiter over the years. So there's some confusion and there's some anger in those meetings. And so the dark-skinned people, the dark-skinned Hawaiians, have basically been put aside by that system. Those who still have the quantum but are very fair-skinned end up being treated differently. And there's a lot of anger that's going on with that. Those who are identifiable, who are truly Hawaiian, really have got pushed off. The reservation for them are the islands, and they end up in places like Las Vegas because they can't afford to live in Hawaii anymore. The concern that they raise is, how do we sit at the table with people who look more and more like the colonizers, who pretend to be us, and there's nothing about what they're doing that represents what we are. Hawaiians didn't have a concept of land ownership. They don't want one. but they want the land that is theirs, pretty much like other Native people. But they have difficulty with people in the room with whom they're talking who supposedly are them, but are treated differentially, more positively because they're much later. Are you seeing any of that? Does any of that come in with the work that you're doing?
I would say on a personal level, yes. I remember we do a lot of groups at Native American, and there was some comments about who, because there were a few Caucasian and Native mix, including myself, and there were some comments about like, well, it's easier for you to get things done. It's easier for people to listen to you, and
Yeah.
I agree. I also want to say from personal experience, I don't often think people believe me that, that I'm Native. I actually have a good amount of information and knowledge regarding that, but that's not what our community as a whole or society as a whole focuses on, right? It's like, well, you look this way, you need your card. People always say like, well, do you have a card? Are you enrolled? And it's like, well, are you?
Well, on the positive side with that, what happens in Hawaii is those who think about the trash sisters who are willing to take stands, they have an audience that the others do not have, and so they have taken it on themselves to speak where other voices are not being heard. And that certainly puts them out there because there could be some ramifications for that. But there's sort of a soft request demand of people who look, you say more, and the risk you take is to use your native to start doing native things. So it may open some other doors for you.
Well, I have an idea because of who I am. I think I might have gotten some different information. I mean, there was a point which I actually wanted to bring this in. I just couldn't find a point. Like
Yeah.
Okay.
one of my participants was saying to me, "I'm tired of people focusing on." Didn't take this badly, but tired of people focusing on the negatives about our culture. We're not all alcoholics. We're not all poor. We're not all this, all the negatives that we hear about, because that's what we hear about, right? Like, oh, they all live in a slum and whatever. He's like, I want people to hear about our resiliency, and Native communities, no matter mixed, whatever, are extraordinarily resilient. And I really wanted my dissertation to focus on that. I felt like across the board, no matter, everyone had different experiences, I felt a lot of resilience and strength from my participants. So, I think because I look the way I do and who I am, they really wanted me to hear this. Like,
Okay.
So that's what I got from my experience.
That was quite nicely put.
Runs like fun, didn't it?
Susie, you mentioned earlier, talk a little bit about the idea of 23andMe and that what genetics are now allowing in terms of blood quanta, for example, that people who either don't know or in no way look, for example, to be Native American, can identify themselves by virtue of what their DNA looks like. So I'm curious, just from the data itself, whether anyone really sort of talked about what the changing meaning of what it means to be Native American was, or just from your own speculation, what you think that landscape is going to look like, let's say in 30 years when maybe most of the United States is genotyped, and you can say I'm 1/256th Native American.
I don't really think it was that much addressed. I would say there was a pretty split down the middle of my participant set. People who, like I said, had strong caretaker influence and knowledge were very much like, I know who my grandparents are. I know, where I come from. I know my creation story. That was what they focused on. They really didn't want me to focus on blood quantum or enrollment, and they said it was a discriminatory measure put in by the federal government to break us up, and it was. That's what it was there for. And they're outraged that some tribes use this, but they also could see, they only have so many resources to go around, and if you're talking benefits, then I guess that's where they're stuck in a rock and a hard place. From my own personal thoughts, I am scared a little bit because, the census has opened up for people to check off more than one box. This is part of the other reason I did my dissertation, because this population is going to be growing in the idea that people are feeling more willing to identify as more than one group, right? Because the government says you can, so now let's do it. And I think there's going to be a huge controversy. It's just getting bigger and bigger. And I also just read an article about how Native DNA has changed significantly from like 2,000 years ago, and what a loss that is. That really like made me sad to read that, and it's going to continue on changing. But I also think there's just like a piece of specialness to have that. No matter how much whatever you have, it's a special. I'm biased, but it's special to keep that. And I want people to be able to honor that. But it's hard, because people oppose that or feel uncomfortable with that, right? And I can understand that side too, who, I've always not wanted to say anything because who wants to see this half colonizer or whatever come in here and be like, I'm Native. Like, I've always felt like, oh God, I don't want to talk about this. I also feel like it's a special part too. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Were there any other questions from the audience? Okay. Committee?
I know this is, a potentially fascinating topic, because the kind of questions that came to mind for me is, who's Native and who's not, and who determines who's Native and who's not, and, the insider and the outsider perspective, and, skin color privilege or not, and, they're just so, well, what if, people are discovering more about their heritage in general and Native heritage specifically, and then what does it mean if you really don't have a community, because who's defining who's Native, right? So I don't know, it's a very interesting, and I think that your participants in what you were describing struggled with some of that, because it's not, and because of phenotype, it erases your face. I know that this was one of the things that came up in Color Fear, that video, but it's not typically it's not left to you, which is so bizarre, right? For you to say, well, this is who I am, and then for other people to say, are you sure? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So it is very complicated. And I don't know, I wonder, again, thinking about the clinical implications, in terms of that struggle of having an internal sense of identity that's not mirrored or validated in the world around you. And that might be another interesting piece to think a little bit about. And I think it would be more common, of course, with multiracial Native Americans. From a clinical perspective, how do you work with that? That's very fascinating.
And how do you train people to work with that? The kind of two-pronged things, what's needed.
It's interesting. I think the client's worldview in problem solving is going to be critical. I think I shared with Andre, when I lived in Africa, I never was questioned so much in terms of whether or not I was black. And that had never happened in terms of me being an African American. That, living in Africa, the first thing they do want to know is who is your clan, your tribe, and it goes all the way back. And so, years ago, when we were taken, those kinds of factors were lost. And so to go back and say that I am black, they see most blacks from the U.S. that we claim, they see us as more American than African Americans. And so it's, very similar. But I think until you are part and then express kind of how you think, how you live, how you view, and then when they see that worldview, then the acceptance is there, but not necessarily because you think you look like someone.
Or you self-identify in a certain way. Yeah. That's interesting.
Do you intend to present your findings at any conferences?
Yes.
So I'm going to go ahead and send you this information. I'll send it to your chair also, put a little pressure on you. They present, it's probably too late to get accepted now, but they present in August in Scottsdale on the
That's the one
reservation.
you go to,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. And it's called the 8th, and the next one that you're eligible for is the 8th Men and Women's Annual Gathering, and in this case for healing. It's well done, and it's probably 7 different nations that are there.
Okay.
And it's expanding. I would go, I'd like to encourage you to present your paper there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to present at Native American. It's part of my deal. So I have to actually contact the supervisor to do that. Yeah.
And it's at the Talking Stick Resort, and so you've been a native land while you're there. And there's several ceremonies that take place before the conference begins that you might enjoy.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can ask our guests to depart for a few minutes, so we can discuss.
You may do that, yes.
I'll let you look at. Right. Here you go. I'll make you feel better.
Isn't that adorable?